My name is Meg Sattler from Ground Truth Solutions, and I'm joined by my colleagues Nada and Sama from Arab World for Research and Development, both of whom have names that sound much better not in an Australian accent, so I apologise to both of you profusely for that. And we collectively thank you for choosing to spend the next hour with us. Welcome also to Najla Shower, who has joined us for our conversation today. Najla has been a humanitarian worker for about 18 years, mostly in Gaza. She's also been chairwoman of the board of the Gaza Culture and Development Group since 2006, and is also a yoga instructor and positive psychology practitioner. Having left her home in Gaza in November, she is joining us from Egypt. So thank you so much, Najla, for joining the conversation today. We have quite a diverse audience if the registrations are anything to go by. So we have some people from the region, some not in the region, some practitioners, some people working more on the policy level. So hopefully everyone will find something to take away with them today. We're all here because we're either following or working on in some way the harrowing situation in Gaza. It's exactly 4 months today since October 7, which is a long time, too long for people to be living with relentless bombardment. And it's also one of the toughest situations for humanitarianism that many have seen. Today we're going to discuss our report, which is called Stop the War and Let Me Return to My Home Even If It's Destroyed. That was a direct quote from someone who we interviewed for the report, and we felt that it sort of neatly summarised a lot of the sentiment that came out during the discussions. To sort of manage expectations about what this report is, it's not by any means a typical humanitarian needs assessment, nor is it an evaluation or a sort of way of assessing the performance of particular humanitarian agencies. It's more a snapshot of people's views, perceptions, priorities, and means of mutual support at what we see as being quite a critical time. There aren't many ways to systematically hear from people in Gaza, and we wanted to just see in some imperfect way if we could help to provide that opportunity and just see what people were saying at what scale. To provide some evidence behind a lot of the narrative information that's been coming out of Gaza. So I'll run through the report findings quite quickly. I'm not going to be able to go through them with the nuance that they deserve, but hopefully afterwards you can ask us some questions. Also, please do read the report if you get a moment to, and we're happy to also follow up with people bilaterally. We'll then hear some reflections from Samer at Aurad, reflections from Najla, and then hopefully we'll have some time also for some questions. So without further ado, I'll launch into the report findings and then we can kick off. A very quick intro to who we are. Some of you may know none of us, one of our organisations or both. Ground Truth Solutions is an organisation that tracks perceptions of people in crisis to make sure that people's views are sort of front and centre in both humanitarian policy making and implementation. An Arab World for Research and Development is a pioneering research and consulting and development firm based in Palestine, and one of the Arab region's premier firms providing partners with consulting and technical support on sustainable development. So why track perceptions in Gaza? I've gone into this, I guess, a little bit in the introduction. There was a lack of robust data, and there still is, if you compare Gaza to other humanitarian crises, where sometimes, there's sort of a proliferation of needs assessments and different data collection exercises just to gather that sort of robust evidence of the situation. We also felt it was quite important to just have an accountable record to complement these various narrative updates that we see coming out of Gaza. Hopefully it can inform aid operations, and since releasing it, we've had some quite interesting and in-depth discussions with people working in Gaza who are trying to grapple with some big questions about how to approach certain things given the current situation. It's also to support advocacy efforts about some of the limitations of aid, support maybe some tough discussions by using a sort of people first approach. We also wanted to launch a first data collection for ongoing tracking so that we can continue to track these moments in time as the situation progresses. I'm not calling it a baseline because it's not a baseline. I think the ship for a baseline has long sailed. And then I guess overall, and as with all of our work and our sort of reason for being, particularly at GTS, it's just about hearing from the people. And that was something that was very important to both us and our ad to look at when it comes to issues of aid and support. What are the people who are most affected by this saying, and how do we sort of look at that next to the humanitarian narrative and come up with a more comprehensive and nuanced picture? So our research, we developed this sample for our quantitative work based on the most recent census data as well as current humanitarian data about things like population movements and people who've been affected. We conducted a face-to-face survey of circa 600 people, slightly less. We also conducted qualitative interviews to sort of dig a little bit deeper when people were comfortable talking, finding out more about what was behind some of the statistics that came out, and also gathered a few case studies about different ways that people in Gaza were helping each other. There's more detailed methodology information at the back of the report. Obviously, it wasn't a context that was conducive to a perfect research environment, but our ad has an amazing team of people who really did their best in very difficult circumstances to make sure that we were able to still conduct this research in a way that was as robust and methodologically sound as possible. So who we talked to, we tried to get a decent gender split. So you'll see here 49% women, 51% men. Various ages. We interviewed people only over the ages of 18 for this research, knowing that it's important definitely to hear from youth. There's such a high percentage of young people in Gaza, but for protection reasons and the speed with which we wanted to produce this, we decided not to this time. In terms of displacement, we tried to sort of echo the displacement data. So at the time of doing this, I think the figure was about 85% displaced. We spoke to 81% displaced and 19% who had not yet been displaced. Locations were quite limited by the security situation. So mostly we worked in the south. You'll see here, though, that we tried to talk to people who had come from various parts of Gaza. So Gaza City, North Gaza, Deir Bella, Khan Yunis and Rafah. And in terms of the places where people are living, about half were living in shelters or camps, tents, 19% in their original residence, 18% with family, 3% in a rented residence, and 4% who were living in sort of other situations. The findings, as I said, I'll go through them quite quickly, but I'll try and cover as much as I can. The first thing we wanted to flag is that in doing this research, we didn't want to take an approach of what are your needs, how should humanitarians meet them? That was sort of the narrative that we were trying to counter. So we had a big focus on coping mechanisms and looking at what were they, how were they being impacted, and looking particularly through the open-ended answers that we got and people's ability to sort of speak in a more narrative way. It was very clear that this constant fear is really pushing people and their coping mechanisms to their limits. People talk a lot about fear for other people, so fear for their families, losing families, what this will mean for their loved ones, sort of before fears for themselves, but there was also a lot of mention of this existential fear. That's obviously linked to a lack of safety. So at the time of doing this research, there were 9% of people who said that they felt safe where they were currently staying. The rest of them either never did or only did sometimes. And along with a lot of narratives that are coming out of the humanitarian space about people just having nowhere to go, we asked people if they had to leave their location, if they had a place to go, and only 3% of people answered positively. The rest of them saying that they either didn't have anywhere to go or didn't know if they had somewhere to go. And the fear is sort of, as I alluded to before, it's fear upon fear. So it's not just existential survival fear and fear of injury. It's also this fear of a loss of a future, inability to rebuild, fear of children's education. So it's a lot of different compounding factors. There were a lot of different quotes that came out in some of the open-ended parts of the research. I'm afraid that I will die and no one will know about me and no one will report me. My biggest fear is forced displacement and not being able to rebuild, or the destruction, losing family members. There's a quote here from a woman who, she's scared of everything. I'm afraid to leave the house. I'm afraid of the future, our fate. I'll be injured and have an amputation. I'm afraid that I'll die. I'm afraid that I'll lose one of my daughters. And there was, as I said before, mostly when people spoke about what they were worried about, it was about someone else slightly before themselves, which I guess is a normal human reaction. In terms of how people are coping with this, the vast majority of people referenced religion, prayers. There was also a lot of people who spoke about looking after children, which makes sense to any parents, I guess. You just sort of have to in situations like this, and it can be a coping mechanism in itself. Some of these were a bit more sort of survival focused, evacuating to a safer place, seeking assistance. 54% said venting or seeking psychological support. And at the time of the research, 31% still said that they were able to work and that they were sort of using that as a way to take care of themselves and their families. In terms of what had most hindered their ability to do that, to take care of themselves or others, the top two here: feeling unsafe, lack of aid and support, loss of income, fear of violence. But you'll see that people here could choose multiple answers, which is why all of these are so high. Lack of privacy, exhaustion and fatigue, sadness, they were also right up there as well. Depression was something that 79% of people said was impacting them. Having to constantly move, which is something that we know people are doing. They're not moving once, they're having to sort of continue to relocate. And almost half, pretty much half, 49% of people said that they were hindered by either an injury or a sickness, which is huge. And that definitely aligns with a lot of the warnings from, the World Health Organization and others about the current health situation. We asked about coping mechanisms as well. As you'll see from this graph, almost everyone has been, rationing food and water. So postponing showering, drinking dirty water is something that most people have been doing, reducing food rations for family members, living with other people in a common space, separating family members to live in different areas. Assistance from international institutions is quite low, which aligns with the rest of our research. So yeah, you can sort of see that the means of coping, some are more positive than others. What was very clear from this research, both in the quant and the qual and the case studies and the whole thing, was that community and family support is really critical. Now that's probably quite obvious. But in terms of who had offered people the most support since the scale up of hostilities, definitely the biggest answer there was family. This question asked about the most support, not just any support. So I'll also add to that everyone surveyed had received some sort of community support and or was providing it, with 23% of people saying that the place that they most have received support was from humanitarian workers, both local and international. This illustrates what I was just talking about giving or receiving community support. So if you look at the right of this slide, Um, the majority of people have received food, water, some support with shelter or housing. Also, over half of people have received support with things like charging their phones and receiving electricity. Childcare is a big one. Over on the left is what people have been providing to other people. The biggest one there is organising daily affairs in the household or shelter, followed by food, participating in burials for people, looking for survivors, shelter, housing. And I want to draw attention to what we call here organising daily affairs, which at the time of the report came up so much and maybe took a while to get our heads around. But basically, that's anything that you need to do in a day, is what people are not only having to really focus on, just getting through day by day and all the things you might need to do to get through that day and try and think about the next one. It's also the most support that people are giving to other people. So that can change day by day. It can be anything from working out how to receive assistance, helping someone put up a shelter, find information that they need, find somewhere to charge their phone, think about what sort of communal cooking situation is going to be happening that day, ask questions about does someone else's kid need support. And it was an interesting finding because although it was quite obvious, even the way that we've laid it out here shows that sometimes the way that we understand these sorts of issues is still very siloed and very sort of humanitarian jargony. And that one, which sort of crosses over into all of the other sections, is the one that is all consuming for people. And that's something that I think is quite important for the humanitarian sector to always remember, is that those daily needs are just changing so much because of people's inability to plan. There's also a lot of work that's happening at the community level in a way that's a bit more organised. So I mentioned the daily tasks. We also gathered case studies of locally led aid collectives where people had come together to provide support to each other or to broader community groups. There's an example in the report of quite a young person who had established a community collective where they were sort of gathering resources from a bunch of different people, mobilizing different volunteers, people bringing together different things to sort of stockpile different resources and then distributing those to different people. And they were reaching about 700 people a day. Some of the feedback from them was that it was really important for these types of efforts to be led by the community because it was a bit easier for them in some ways to better target the assistance, and also to address some of the issues that are coming out with the need for blanket assistance, like people saying the international organisations are focusing a lot on canned food and bread, which is basically what they can get in, but that these are not always what is needed. You'll see here the example of people making rice and milk pudding specifically for children. Also references to how these collectives are run. There was an example here of the volunteers meet every day and divide into groups to distribute parcels. Most of them work for free, but when we can, we give them 50 shekels or food parcels to take home. There's also examples of people's different experiences of moving. Maybe they moved somewhere, received help from a friend or family, moved somewhere else, received help from a stranger, and probably ended up either staying where they were or going into some sort of shelter structure. But everyone's journeys are full of these stories of kind of mutual support. In terms of what people are calling for, basic needs are, for obvious reasons, quite high on the agenda. We had asked a question about whether people felt that it would be important to sort of look at existing economic structures and support them more rather than doing, basic distributions. But it was very clear that, just the need daily for things like food and clean water and knowing what shelter you're going to be in is so pronounced that is definitely what people are calling for. In terms of aid, as we sort of know it in a formal sense, it's not a big part of people's lives at the moment. A lot of people don't know how to access it. So when we ask people this question, do you know currently how to access humanitarian assistance? 89% of people said no. That's not to say that none of them had received humanitarian assistance, and I think about 30% of people had. I have to go back and look at the stat since October 7, which is a much lower figure than some of the reporting that we see. And it's also a very much lower figure than the number of people who were receiving aid before October 7. We asked people who had been receiving aid before how that had changed, and the most common answer was some version of it's been cut off or I'm not receiving it anymore. For those who had received support, primarily they'd received food, potable or clean water, some support with healthcare or first aid, medicines, although there were a lot of calls for medicine. That seemed to be a big gap in the response. Support with shelter, help with childcare. About 20% of people said they'd received some support with electrical capacity, hygiene supplies. So they're the types of aid that people had received. In terms of the experience of receiving the aid, not super positive. I mean, I think we've all seen the footage, or many on this call would have been probably involved in some of these distributions. It's not an easy time for aid distribution. 40 odd percent of people said they received aid when they needed it, and about 33% said they felt respected when receiving it. But mostly the feedback was, overall it hasn't really helped do what it needed to do. By and large, though, a lot of the more negative commentary on it was about the way that people, I guess, felt. The sense that it wasn't fair came up a lot, and that was elaborated on in some of the qualitative answers where people spoke about, whole people who had never received anything, who were very vulnerable, people being reached with blanket assistance when obviously they had very different needs. There was a really negative answer here on whether or not receiving the aid sort of helped you to feel dignified. Another question we asked was about what was important to people at this time, and maintaining dignity was really high, so that answer definitely makes sense. And most people obviously didn't feel that the aid was enough, which I suppose is obvious given the situation. There were a lot of comments about women and children needing more specific support, both in terms of women speaking about their own issues, that being sort of a general point of feedback from various people. So there was examples here of someone who was pregnant and didn't have a mattress. She needed more healthy food than was available, specific vitamins. Infant formula came up a lot. Diapers, nappies, whatever you want to call them, was another sort of constant call. Milk, children's clothes, blankets. It was very cold when we did this work, so a lot of people were asking for assistance with that as well. And there was this one example here that you'll see on the right, which sort of illustrates, there are definitely, as anywhere, women who were already having quite a tough time had sort of been pushed to the brink because of this situation. So this woman, she's afraid of everything. I'm afraid of the bombing, and when I'm alone, I've not received help from anyone. I don't know why. I need psychological support for myself and my children. I'm abused by my husband, but I don't know where to go or who to talk to. And she also talks about her husband being a gatekeeper for information, which has sort of further expanded her level of anxiety. So there were other, as well as women and children, there were calls for more support for specific people with disability, people with chronic illnesses like cancer, some queries around, can aid be better distributed based on family size, different vulnerabilities, children and elderly people shouldn't get the same thing, etc. And some of those quotes you'll see coming up on this slide. I think I've covered most of these already, but I'll just say again this medicine point because it came up quite a few times. There was a sense that people who needed medicine just had nowhere to get it from. There's a quote here, the UN doesn't have it. And people who need medical treatment that isn't, acute trauma related treatment are just unable to get it. So some of my family members have cancer, chronic diseases, they're in dire need of treatment, which is not available. In terms of information, we asked people where they were getting information from, to which most people answered word of mouth. So the examples of that are things like people saying, I get my information from the person who is staying in the tent next to my tent, or people who are sort of living in the same vicinity. A close second to that was the radio. So a lot of people are turning to radio for news. Despite the challenges with connectivity, 40% of people still reference social media, and 30% messaging apps. We've got here WhatsApp. There's also Telegram that was included in that. Facebook, people spoke about getting information from like Instagram, journalists. And not only could they sort of not access that very often, but that was a real source of stress as well. So people saying things like, this is where I get my information from, but I can only get it when I have connectivity, etc. Which you can visualize that, I guess, by going back to this daily support process where that could be half of someone's day, would be trying to find somewhere to charge their phone. But overall, trust is really, really low. So a lot of quotes like this one, I do not trust any information, nothing. There was an example of someone who said, I really don't trust anything unless I can verify it physically myself. So she was taking the approach of kind of walking around and asking different people questions and trying to triangulate whatever information she could. People are sort of really relying on whatever information they can get, but it's very clear that they're not fully trusting almost anything. Humanitarian agencies and UN, you'll see here that's really low, as is Gaza government agencies. So it sort of aligns with this mutual support idea. People are very much relying on each other for news and information, but that's also possibly because there's just not anymore the sort of news sites and information that people were used to getting prior to October 7. And overall, I guess, asking people, what they wanted people to know or what they wanted the international community to do. Just the translation of these three words, stop the war, came up so many times. People also just talking a lot about, death, destruction, fear. Stop the massacre of civilians was a quote that came up, I guess, another way of saying the same thing. But overall, and why we sort of looked at the quote that we chose for the heading of the report as well, is that this is just so pervasive. People are so scared. They just want this situation to stop. And despite the fears they have about their futures, they really want an opportunity to to go home and to try and rebuild. So I will stop there. I know I just sort of went through a lot at a very surface level, so I do hope that you read the report, but I'm going to hand over now to Samer to just reflect on that a little bit, provide some concluding remarks on the research, and then we'll also hear from Najla. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Meg, and thank you to everyone else who took the time to join us today. It's unfortunate that kind of 4 months into the war that we are that the violence continues and that we continue to be unable to have panelists speak from inside Gaza on occasions like this. And the idea behind this study was to truly kind of try to capture voices from Gaza. So as you've seen in the methodology part, we've only talked to people. We didn't talk to practitioners. We didn't talk to key informants, to agencies. The idea was to really try and give voice to the people in this critical moment, both to kind of reflect on what they're doing, but to also kind of as a plea and as a database and as a source of information, and that is kind of evidence based for people to use as a resource as they shape their response to what's happening in Gaza today. And I think it's really important to highlight that uh, my reflections, and I also given the audience, are going to be on both the edge of politics and development and aid, and I'm going to probably touch on both issues. I mean, I want to start with thinking with important findings for me and conclusions from this report um, is this idea that we all sit back in awe and think about, like, where are these resources coming from? How are people surviving in Gaza? And perhaps one of the most important lessons to me was that when you think that all former resources are depleted, people dig deeper and find more. They are also capable of making more with the very little that they have. So what we've noticed is that there is this kind of there, there is a ripple effect and there is an aggregation effect when people started to come together in Gaza, especially through non-formal means. Which means, if I can give you a few examples to make this a bit more concrete. So a person who might have I don't know, a few spoonfuls of salt can't do much with them. But when you have a few spoonfuls and the next person has a few spoonfuls, and we bring it all together and bring maybe some wheat flour and all of that, then we can actually bake and make some bread. So we've seen communities come together, especially through non-formal means, and put everything they have on the table, even the very, very little that they might have, in order for them to, to cope, to survive, to find ways to continue with the business of daily living, whether it's providing food or water or safety, or otherwise. So that's kind of one of the main findings for me. Another important finding is social capital, and how people, early on, the views, the perceptions of this war and the views inside Gaza on this war are highly actually varied. And that can be seen maybe in some of our polling that we did at the end of October, early November. But so people's kind of psychology and people's mental status and all of that, some people, thought that this is going to end in few weeks, that this might not last. Others thought, no, that this is going to get, might be a bit longer. But the idea again here is that people who worked and kind of continued to try to work and to go out and to serve others, whether it's through, again, formal mechanisms or non-formal mechanisms, have actually managed to had this multiplier effect on communities and on society, maybe more generally, but mainly on communities, in which kind of, if you have a small spot in which you opened non-formally, the best example of this is perhaps the hot kitchens that we're seeing maybe pop everywhere. If you had kind of a small spot to cook for a few people or for the people in your neighborhood, that really had the community to kind of come and mobilize around you, and to come and also, first of all, give and provide assistance to that kind of more to that structure, as well as receive assistance from that structure. And that kindness and these acts kind of pulled more on board and kept on pulling more and more people on board. So kind of we see how important, you know, these acts of kindness were um, to move people, especially active people, from kind of fatalism towards work, and in certain cases, of course, heroism. At the end of the day, the stories of and kind of the heroic acts of the communities and the people of Gaza are, I think, you know, becoming are documented across social media and the news and all of that. But this was also the findings of the study also kind of refer and highlight and emphasize that. Um, and now also on kind of on the development side of things is that we this is and this is for perhaps the practitioner here in the room, we we can't be doing this as usual. This is a very extreme situation, and of the very important the normal ways we do things just do not account for the extremity. So it's really important to kind of internalize that, go back to some of the drawing boards, think about what is the best approach for us to do things. And here it's very important to kind of remind people that at the end of the day, regardless of how many trucks enter to Gaza, that is not enough to prevent famine, right? If we don't know where to prevent famine, you really need to make sure that you have access, that you're capable of reaching people, that you're capable of um, first of all expanding horizontally, but also expanding, continuing to kind of have a focus on the most marginalized. And you know, in vulnerabilities where really everyone is extremely vulnerable, right? And everyone is equal in their vulnerability, uh, but uh, but also it's important for us to keep in mind the people who were already vulnerable for structural purposes. Like Meg shared the quote from the woman with the husband who's violent and who's an abuser and all of that, where she's stuck with him. That's probably something that kind of makes you vulnerable in the context of war and in the context of before the war. But today, that vulnerability is is we can't leave things out of mind just because you know we think that everyone is vulnerable now, then there is kind of no differentiation whatsoever. It's really important for us to keep in mind that, you know, um, uh, uh, and this is a reminder perhaps to not lose sight, right? To not be just follow one path without kind of, because everyone is vulnerable, that means that, you know, there is no differentiation in the levels of kind of vulnerability and marginalization. While I fully this study also shows kind of the degree of vulnerability and the degree of need. It's important to also try to capture and to kind of cater our to the assistance and aid to the specific needs of people as much as possible and to the degree possible, and not to paint everyone and everything with one brush. At the end of the aid and and aid trucks are probably the only source of goods that are entering into Gaza. So it's really important.
I know that Sam is having connectivity issues, so I'll just give him a second, see if he makes it back. Are you
Hello?
back with us, Summer?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry for that. I'm in the field, so I have bad internet. So a good example is we went and we documented the story from a formal shelter in which the manager of the shelter actually would not let families with persons with disability into the shelter. Right? They will tell them, please take, and although you would expect that these shelters will actually be open to the most marginalized, even informal assistance, what we're finding is that that family was asked to leave the school because the burden of that family and the burden of the persons with disability within that family was much larger on the school and the shelter managers. So they actually asked them to maybe build a tent outside the school, outside the shelter, and and to try and seek assistance through other means. So kind of taking this not easy way out, but to continue the marginalization of the people who are already marginalized. So it's very important for us as I see, especially as I work with some people in the development sector and the humanitarian aid sector. As we jump in one pool, we need to stay kind of aware of what's happening in the other. And as we jump into kind of over to universal targeting and to giving assistance to everyone, that actually requires more care from us to kind of keep those who need prioritization to also continue to kind of vertically expand what they're receiving, and to um, um, yeah, and to also reach. It's very important for us to reach everyone, not just to kind of keep on counting how many meals we've distributed or how many kits we've assisted. I'm sorry again. I'm going to try and conclude actually, just so I can also because of this internet issue, to find ways to get to Gaza, to find ways to get to North Gaza, to find ways to get to the eastern parts of all 5 governorates of the Gaza Strip. These are areas that are not reached by by aid, and these are people who we were not able even to survey. So if we do survey in the future, we'll probably find even a more drastic picture of reality, because no one can access those areas, and even safe convoys with kind of safety guarantees are normally turned around and not allowed or given entry. The last 2 points that I kind of want to quickly talk about um, is um, is perhaps on more of the political side. And on the political side, what I want to say is that it seems like what's happening now in Gaza is actually building on a long policy of de-development and of de-development in Gaza, and maybe creating a degree of dependency on aid. This is something that we've seen with the blockade. The blockade has been ongoing for 18 some years now, and there has been that policy has been at work for a very long time before today. And it seems like there is an intentional policy right now, and this is something that everyone kind of, especially working in this sector, need to be careful and kind of aware of. There seems to be kind of a push for the continuation of de-development and continuation of increasing dependency in Gaza. And that seems to be, and it seems like, you know, the international powers and some of, and those directly involved in the war are trying to create maybe some sort of a Gaza. A political void means that the structures in which the governing structures are going to become, and are most likely the default or the de facto governing structures are going to become those that are built and maintained by humanitarian and aid agencies. And that means that we're going to be in this kind of protracted state of um, state of de-development, limited governance, and kind of what the examples of Northwest Syria and how aid agencies are playing a very large role in maintaining kind of just the bare minimum. And same thing in maybe in Somalia, in kind of maintaining the very bare minimum. It seems like if things continue as is, it seems like that's one way that Gaza might be heading towards. Yeah, and I think that's it for me, and I'm gonna turn it off to Najla, and hopefully she'll be able to even, give a more human voice to all of this.
Thank you so much, Sama. Well, I think we mainly got that, so your internet managed to hold out for most of it, which was great. Najla, we'll turn to you now. And I mean, you obviously are approaching this through many different sets of eyes, primarily as a human being who is very directly impacted by this crisis. But you've also got the vantage points of being a humanitarian, very experienced practitioner. And finally, also someone with a very refined understanding of well-being and psychology. So yeah, I guess we're interested to hear from you. How does this report resonate with you? And what are your sort of key takeaways or conclusions or things that you think people should be thinking about when it comes to thinking about the current situation in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Meg. Thanks, Samir, and thanks to both of you on this very important report. And I think it's indeed important to have a kind of follow-up to track the perceptions of people. Unfortunately, as we speak now, the desperation is just mounting to another peak. And it's extremely sad and painful that none of us or none of this is actually going to be changing or stopping or improving for people, no matter how long we speak here. However, just to maybe reflect a little bit, probably the audience of this webinar are well aware of that previous to October, the situation has been already under enormous pressure, and in Gaza more, but also in the West Bank. I think the entire Palestinian, the Palestinian existence, I would say, has been also under threat. Now, in terms of the vulnerability of the populations, I think I would take some of what Samir has mentioned, but also emphasize the fact that the depletion has been already starting way before, I think, yani days before October 7th, let's say. I think there were 200,000 people unable to secure their basic food voucher due to some fund cut from the World Food Program, for example, and there were like appeals everywhere to try and secure that. So you're talking about a very fragile situation already prior to that, Awrad themselves have been engaged in researches before, trying to also highlight that, along with the work that I've been doing with Oxfam, how critical the situation has been in the Gaza Strip, and that it is impossible to even do the business as usual. Now, I think what's really problematic at this stage is that the threat is far beyond. I think that the impact has already happened. You're talking about real real devastation that is already taking place now. I don't think if somebody from Gaza would hear us, would be feeling that we are speaking up to the same level. I know this research came from the people, but maybe with the duration that since the data was collected until this moment, I think how harder things have become and how more bleak and less hopeful people are. I think it's not easy to see what Samir is saying, except for some maybe small, examples here and there. But there's an overwhelmingly feel of desperation. There is real deprivation. I mean, I never believed that I would feel as a humanitarian or working in this sector to really feel that myself and me and my colleagues and my friends and my family in that extent that I would actually be on the street of Deir al-Balah celebrating that there is one truck that came in because I can buy some canned food. I mean, experiencing all that, I think at that scale and at that level of lack of reporting, lack of accountability, all what you all guys know and the audience know very well about these practices, I think is just beyond what we are describing even right now. The existential threat is also what's the concern, because the worry is what this is going to bring tomorrow for Palestinians. Is there a tomorrow? What kind of tomorrow? So I'm not even sure that we are even allowed to even think along what's being proposed right now. I think if you really want to protect any kind of existence of Palestinians, the effort has to be a much bigger one and maybe very different of what's happening, because it is really increasing across the board in Gaza and in the West Bank in parallel in terms of the Palestinian issue in itself. Now, what comes also in on top of these problems is that what makes it also very hard, I think, that when you have examined issues like the fear of the people, the fear that that detailed or explanation of what people feared. I think this is at the collective and the individual level now. There's no vision to how people would see their lives in the coming future. I mean, I would say even though those who fled Gaza, but of course, most importantly, those who are inside under these very uncertain and really brutal circumstances, especially at the border with Rafah. Now we are seeing the peak of it, and the worry is that this is going to. It seems that it is going to continue to deprive more people, and sadly, there is no going back. And there is what I mean. There's no going back. That there's already harm in terms of the societal breakdown. I'm sorry to be very pessimistic, but but we have to face it. I think this is also very much happening, and there's a limit to what human beings can endure and can cope with. I'll stop here in case there are questions. I know we're running out of time. I don't want to go on because you pretty covered most of the points. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you so much, Najla. And there's a lot of that, I think, it's hard to take in, but it's also very apparent, both from, looking at our report, but also any sort of information that's coming out of Gaza. I think the question that comes up so much is like, when does this break? Like how much can a human being take? And that was something that, to me, I mean, there's always a fear that you're not going to be able to adequately capture that in a report. And I think probably we haven't, because, it's a report with graphs on it and not a lot of narrative information in it. But I really felt, having, I guess, the sort of privilege of going through Excel sheets with just word after them that were all the same, and you could almost sort of feel this desperation screaming off the page. And as you say, that was a month ago now. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sobering information there to take in and think about. We do have a few questions in the chat, and we can go a little bit longer. I'll start by maybe answering some of the sort of practical research ones. There was a question about during the part about emergency aid putting people at risk, are we talking about people being targeted when they seek aid and fighting over it? That was probably more of a semantics thing, and I potentially used the wrong headline there. What that slide was referring to was more about people missing out on aid when they were very, very vulnerable. So the implications of sort of blanket, no regrets targeting approaches, which happen for reasons that we all understand, are having very grave implications for people who are elderly or who have chronic illnesses, or who, as Sama referenced before, were already marginalised. They're not being reached by this sort of blanket assistance, which it does have quite dire consequences. There's a question here which is interesting. To what extent are existing agricultural capacities still able to be used? Was there any reference to this? There wasn't a huge amount of reference to that in our work, which was largely because we didn't ask about it. So I don't know, Najla or our ad colleagues, is there anything that you would have to add on that question?
Yeah, I think I can generally speak from reading some reports, and also anecdotally. I think what we are seeing is that the agricultural sector is already suffering from before that. Imagine the scale of destruction and the explosives that have been put into that soil, in addition to the destruction of all kind of infrastructure. So I would say it's severely impacted. Anyone who monitors the agricultural situation in Palestine or in Gaza in particular would very much know how much there is suffering, and there is depletion in resources. There is even observed impact of climate change, in addition to the very practical restrictions that the blockade has been imposing on any agricultural activity, in addition to the bulldozing, etc. So that would be my general reflection. But I see Dr. Nader open the camera, so maybe he has better things to say.
Not really, not better at all, but it is just just looking at the map basically of agriculture in Gaza, and where the concentration and just the very limited possibilities are in the north, where we look at Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and that region, and then to the east, basically. And that's where, basically it is fully under occupation. Of course, we've heard about not only the destruction of land and killing of animals and domestic animals, but also poisoning the land. And of course, if the water is poisoned as well. So the issue is the prospects here, not just what we have now, but again, what we have seen. And we celebrate every small victory here and there, is that people are insisting, like, and you look at some of the villages on the east side, there are still people who are still actually planting because they need to eat. And they are, if you sometimes look at the markets, you will find some vegetables here and there. You will find a few things here and there. And these are people who are insisting actually to use what they have. And this is what we're talking about, the depletion of these resources, so that people can, in a very minimalist survival mode, and as such, agriculture, and that's, I think, what Samer and Najla were saying, is that this is a long-term issue and cannot be resolved as another humanitarian crisis, because not only it has humanitarian principles issues, developmental needs, but much more, for Palestinians, it's a political issue. Will this become another just a small island for humanitarian agencies to just create dependency? And most people, I think the feeling that you get when you do the interviews is that whose side are you on? Even as a research institution, we just were made feel, whose side are you on? Are we in the long run as humanitarian agencies creating the conditions that enable injustice and genocide and all of that, or do we create the conditions that will emancipate, create human development sustainability, and then at the end, people will be somewhat equal in the region, and they will be able to live together, actually. And, because again, humanitarian is related to developmental, but much more to the politics of the place and the international community, as those who are aiding Israel in its genocide are the same ones who are sending food as well. So not everyone, of course, but what I'm saying is, one has to be careful about how the development of Gaza becomes an issue. Palestinians will not accept another just humanitarian, prolonged, protracted crisis in Gaza. It's not going to work, even politically, for those who care for peace and security and all of that.
Thank you so much to both of you. And Nada has been hiding, but I'm glad that he emerged so that everyone got a chance to see him.
I have you guys. You're doing great. So.
There was one question that was a bit more methodological. How did we manage to get to people? Did we use verbal questionnaires? How long did the interviews go for? I don't know, Sam, are you back, or has your internet?
I don't know if Sam, do you want to talk about this, or do you want me to talk about this as you have to get to your flight as well?
Go ahead.
Okay. So anyway, we really had to do, as we started doing research in Gaza, within the attack on Gaza, basically, we had to think very, very carefully about, our ethics as well. So we did not rush into, doing the research, but what we rushed to do is basically build, our teams and see what are the modalities that could work in making sure that our teams are present everywhere. And they were present everywhere because they are part of the people who were impacted in full by everything that happened. So they were moved, they had to move. So instead of sort of wasting this tragic incident of Haneen having to leave from the very north to the very south with her 3 children, under her arms, basically. So she used the trip after she had a minute for herself to write and sends a report. So we used every opportunity, as our team is everywhere basically, but they were also in flux and in movement. Okay. For this, for this one, so we had to wait to make sure we're not doing any harm, we're not really creating more fatigue for people, as people are just exhausted, and that we care about issues, as Najla said, what research if it doesn't help me, if it's not going to contribute? It is so relevant and connected, but will it work? Will it actually help me in any way? And that's, I think, why we're trying to do this, to create some proximity. But we know it's not as direct as it should be. So for this specific research, we use face-to-face tablet-assisted questionnaires. Same for the interviews. We also use the same. We use tablets, and the questionnaire was about 10 minutes, so we didn't, impose too much. The interviews were about 15 to 20 minutes, and what else? I think, was there anything else, Meg, on this question? How did we manage to get to people? People are very easily accessible. Those who are alive and not under the rubble, they're accessible. Because you just have to walk either from the north to the south, and you will find tens of thousands of people walking with you. So people are, treated by the occupation, by the military as bulk, basically. No people, no individuals. So again, that was not very difficult. Again, some of our researchers had to move from one place to another, and then we would change the trajectory of who is doing what where. So it's a very flexible process. Shelters are where most people are, but now, especially in Rafah, they are basically in the streets. And this is something that was not as much in our when we did the research. So we didn't include being in the street, literally. And that's where I think most people are, in addition, of course, to UNRWA and public schools and institutions, lots of host families. But again, that's also becoming sort of a depleted resource as well, because how many homes do you need if 90% are gone? You have 10%, where will people go? Yeah, thank you.
I'll just maybe add to that as well that, the team had to be very flexible because the conditions day by day were changing. So we had planned to do some work in a certain place that then just became completely unsafe and inaccessible. So given that was how there was a question here about the places that we ended up working, and that was how we ended up sort of really focusing on, the places that were I'm not going to say safe, but they were safer to do the research and asking people about their sort of journeys along the way to try and capture more of those diverse perspectives. But I mean, there's no perfect research environment in a crisis like this, so you have to sort of take a, you know, what is a good enough approach in a lot of ways. There's an interesting question here that I might have to again rely on the Palestinian colleagues for. The question is, who do people refer to as the solution for stopping the war? Israel, Hamas, international organizations, USA, whether or not that came up. I mean, I would say just one thing before I hand over was we're always a little bit limited by the way that we ask a question. So a lot of the stop the war answers came up in response to, you know, what do you want to see the international community sort of focusing on? So I guess that's one answer to that question. But to provide some more nuance, I don't know, Nader or Najla, what, if there's anything you want to say on that question.
Yeah, to me, I mean, it's a simple answer. I mean, it's Israel that has to stop. I mean, it's 75 years of occupation, so let's go to the basics.
You know, again, it is, as and I again, we don't know everyone who's behind the screen. We know so many of them, and they're all great people, and I'm sure everyone is. But you know, again, this is not about, you know, a luxury of having a webinar for us, for Najla, for my researcher who just called me now as we speak, you know, saying she's changing course. She has to go from the south now to the north. She's running back to the north, you know. So again, so we're doing research. She's doing research, and it's important not only to do the research, but for us also to send the money for them and to be able to help to create just some. That's part of, you know, the the resilience. And I think, you know, this is it, you know, I think, you know, one of the most important lessons for us as people who work in this field and as humans who really want to see all of this, in addition to all the justice, you know, talk that we insist on as Palestinians, and it will be an entry point for the whole world, actually, which we think that, you know, you become a Palestinian, not a Samaritan, but a Palestinian, meaning that we know what that means now. You know, it was coined as such. But, you know, if we want to be just on a practical level, if we are unable to measure all these informalities that we're trying to see, we still did not measure them yet. Meg was talking about, you know, this is a first study. Hopefully we'll be doing more, but not because we're going to do research at all, but in terms of learning, you know, as humans, you know, because we have confined humans to these international structures that are very bureaucratic, very heavy, very difficult to move forward, and very expensive. So how much, you know, did the informal support and this mutual support and family support community, how much is the value? How much is the value of that? You know, the real market value, the cost of that. And would it be cheaper to, in the long run, to not get rid of all the international organizations, but what I mean is that as humans, wouldn't it be better to really think of how community-led approaches are meaningful? Not on paper, but what I mean is that people are given the power, but for them to be given the power, they need clean water, and they need, you know, food, and they need to travel. So Gaza is not just about food and water. There are beautiful people in Gaza, talented, you know, most of them, you know, have, you know, these creative ideas and crazy ideas, and just, you know, kids, they want to be, you know, everywhere. So I think, you know, the issue of understanding resilience again, you know, and understanding what indicators and how does resilience work is very important under these extreme conditions, but also in terms of costing of the value of each one and the expense of each one, because international aid is very expensive. It's an extremely expensive industry. So can we explore a bit more of the idea of this study? And one more thing, and I think Samer was really, because we work in the field on a daily basis in terms of distribution and all of that, the whole issue of the North and the whole issue of how the international community and the US and those who, wanted to punish UNRWA. It's very interesting because the Americans and USAID specifically worked with what's called the no regret principle in Somalia. And that meant that even that the Shabab group was considered to be a terrorist group, still they decided to go in and distribute food as if it is, you know what I mean? So this no regret principle, while it was a political decision, one has to think of even the double standards on this specific issue. If you are able to work under the Shabab in Somalia, you would be able to work under whoever is here. And we all know that everyone's here is not a terrorist. Everyone's here who's trying to create something that is deal with something that's so unjust. So I think that's it. Sorry.
No, don't say sorry. We're running out of time.
Time.
So I think that's, I think that's a strong point to end on. And I want to just draw us back to what you said about the point of this work. And, we're not doing this work because we think it's interesting. Everyone that we've spoken to for this work is a human being. And what we're seeing in Gaza is, sort of the limits of human suffering, human tenacity, human cruelty. And it can be really difficult, I think, for those who are not living it every day to sort of understand what that is like. And hopefully some of the comments by the colleagues today have helped to bring that to light a little bit, and will continue to as this discussion goes on. There were a few more questions that hopefully we'll be able to answer bilaterally. Please feel free to get in touch with us, our ad colleagues, myself, Najla. And I just want to say a big thank you again to Najla for joining us for this chat, to Nader, Samer, everyone at ORAD for the amazing work and partnership. And yeah, feel free to check out the report, get in touch with us if you have any further comments or feedback on this session. We've had a kind offer for support also throughout the webinar, so thanks so much for that. And I will leave it there. I don't know, Nader, if you have any closing remarks from the ORAD side.
Just a quick thank you for those who attended, because again, some of them are very good friends who I haven't seen for some time, and I see you and I appreciate you, and I know in part why you are attending. So thank you so much. And I know you're in the US, you're in Bosnia, you are in England. I see you. So thank you so much, everyone. Without mentioning names, we'll get in touch, I guess. So thank you. And we would be really happy to continue sort of this overarching monitoring of this movement between the formal humanitarian and the informal humanitarian. I think that would be an extremely valuable exercise. And again, I really wanted to appreciate Meg for her initiative on this and her kind heart that came very quickly to do this and understand now, where do they come from. Najla, thank you for all the work that we have been doing, and just for being there, thank you. Samer, travel safely. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.